Hold on, people. And so Bialik is the most protean and varied transformer of classical and medieval Hebrew into the modern idiom. He's the most protean of the early writers, and he stands at the cusp of modernity. That is to say, the cusp in which classical Hebrew literature is no longer either speaking in its old sacred linguistic forms or its own liturgical forms, but it's already beginning to speak in a contemporary idiom, but not in the highly metaphoric, stylized language of the early part of the 19th century. Bialik appears as a modernist. He'll appear as a modernist, as we're going to see, at the turning point of Jewish modernity. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but Judaism is still going through its cultural reformation as a shift from a religious culture from antiquity through the Middle Ages into the early modern period. And Bialik really represents that tension between traditionalism and secularism, between cultural modernism in terms of culture, in terms of modernism, in terms of his own spiritual personality. And he tried to formulate a language which would articulate both the struggles of the national soul of the Jews coming back to the state, or the foundation of the state of Israel, so the beginning of Zionism, and finding a cultural language, but a language that was also simultaneous with his own conflicts and his own growth as an individual. And the tension between the personal I, and the cultural we, or even the cultural I, is what's characteristic of Bialik as he begins to unfold both poems that articulate his own longing, his own nostalgia, his own sense of pain, his own sense of conflict, and the way he situates himself within modernity, particularly the return to a kind of Jewish national home and a Jewish national identity that is secular. As I'll show in a moment, Bialik grew up in a very traditional environment, but he identified with cultural Zionism and secularism. And the real question is, what kind of language could he develop? How could he formulate a spiritual language that was still resonant with the depth of language in the tradition, but was able to speak to the crisis of modernity, the loss of faith, secularism, isolation, and the need, in a sense, to find a kind of new religious language for coherence. So many of his contemporaries at that particular time, even among contemporary writers like Rilke, is also trying to find a new romantic language for spiritual growth. Kafka is trying to find a new language. They're all at this border point where the old language has exploded, it doesn't work, and they're trying to find a new way in which the traditional language can be revived, but still meets the needs of the pain, the brokenness, and the confusion of what it means to be a modern person, but who is struggling not to float adrift into pure secularism and is trying to retrieve the power of the tradition. So he's protean both in terms of his knowledge, he's protean in terms of the vigor of his inner vision, and he's protean in terms of the way he stands in the cultural landscape of early Jewish modernity. So now let me, with that just a kind of generalization, let me kind of give you a kind of a first bird's eye view of his life and his achievements so that we can have a kind of common level playing field for this. And then I want to go into several of the dialectics between the sacred and the profane that characterize his inner world. So first, let's just get a sense of where he stands in the cultural landscape. So Bialik was born in 1873 in the Pale of Settlement near Zhytomyr, near Kiev in Russia, in areas where there was extraordinary poverty and suffering and anti-Semitism and a total Jewish environment. He dies in Tel Aviv in 1934 as the national poet of Israel. And he transforms himself from a lost orphan, suffering food and loss, which he never abandoned as part of his inner spiritual reality, to the person who was the living voice of modern Israeli culture. When he died in 1934, really in his early 60s, because of an accident in an operation that took place in Switzerland. Nobody actually, because of his greatness, none of the doctors in Israel wanted to operate on him because they were afraid of making a mistake. It was actually not a technical operation, and none of them had the nerve to do it, even the greatest experts. He went to Europe, and by a mere accident, he died of a blood clot and complication of the surgery. And all the newspapers said when the news came was, Chaim Nachman Bialik Einenu. He is gone. He doesn't exist. Notice his presence was presence. He filled the entire vocal and human landscape of Tel Aviv, and going back even into the 1890s with his voice. When his voice ceased, a whole voice of culture ended. It was a voice that was grounded in classical Hebrew, but it was also a voice that wanted to make use of secular language, but was afraid of Hebrew turning into a pure utilitarian language. We'll talk a little bit later on today about a very famous letter that Gershom Scholem wrote about the danger of modern Hebrew simply becoming secular. So he's facing the issue that many traditional cultures face when they're moving from the classical canon of their culture to a literature which wants to meet the needs of the contemporary age, but is afraid of falling into the trap of a purely secular, utilitarian language, and is trying to find a way in which the issue of resonance, we'll come back to this very frequently, the issue of resonance, that within the new language, older resonance appear so that people experience language as depth, and that depth then becomes a source of spiritual transformation and renewal, even in the context of a pure secularism that was far removed from the traditional landscape. So he was born in 1873. By the time he was 5 or 6, he was really an orphan. His father died. His mother was enormously impoverished. The depth of cultural poverty in Russia at that time, particularly among Jews, was astonished, and he was sent to live with his grandfather, who was a traditional Jew. And you have to understand the language would be Russian and Yiddish, okay? And he was then sent to the premier yeshiva or religious college or school of education in Poland at that time, which was called Volozhin. Volozhin was the premier elite institution. And it's there that he first begins to identify himself as a poet with a personal romantic voice that wasn't being expressed by the Jewish literature. And he shared some of these romantic poems with his friends or hid them under the big Talmud folios and read them in secret with some of them. And it's there that he first is what we would call a layered person. You have to understand that in a traditional society, people are layered by their canon. They are expressive of their entire canon, whether they are scholars or ordinary people. The depths of the culture emerges because of people's living embodiment in the culture. And that would even apply to fairly illiterate people in the Pale of Settlement among the Jews, just by virtue of living a traditional Jewish life. Language and idioms and gestures and associations are part of their mother's milk. They just absorb that. And so it's a thick religious environment in which the space is a religious space. Time is religious time. And the use of language revolves around sacred space and sacred time. I'll come back to that in a moment. While he's at Volozhin, he spends his time really as totally absorbed in traditional material, so that the stratification of his life, and this is to understand the traditional person in the old days, is one is a kind of like a cultural series of cultural strata, that one is able to kind of bring up layers of language from one's depth. One speaks the whole resonance of a cultural canon. One doesn't simply speak in a private, idiosyncratic, secular voice. That's going to be the part of the crisis of modernity. Joe, did you have a question? No? No, okay. So, and it's there that he will conceive and write one of his first and most famous epics, which is called the Matmid, the Perpetual Scholar. But within that, he will show two aspects: the language that really was the lifeblood of the Jewish civilization, and his feeling that that language no longer works, that the traditional language has become deracinated, it's become secularized. It no longer speaks to the crisis of what it means to be a modern person who doesn't necessarily believe in God, whose world is broken by political and social turmoil, and who has lost the anchoring of what it means to be a spiritual person. That inner schizophrenia, that split, that deep crisis of the understanding of the deep stratification of traditional culture, but at the conscious level, the level of integrity and honesty, that one has to speak a language that's resonant with what believes or what one doesn't believe, is an inner split that he shared his entire life. Already by the year 1892, he wrote what became the great song of the longing for Zion, that's still sung in Israeli schools. It's called El Hatzipor, to the bird. It's the bird that comes back from the warm climate of the land of Israel and brings news, as if like the bird to Noah on the ark, of the warmth and the vitality that was there. He then began to develop a new language, a language that was able to articulate the great landscape of Russia, the landscape of birds and forests and pools that we'll be talking about. He's able to, that entire landscape, but he's able to put this now into a kind of a personal idiom. And it resonates with people. It's the first time that they're able to think about the land of Israel as a climate that one could live in spatially, imaginatively. And he begins to identify with what was called cultural or romantic Zionism, as opposed to political Zionism. That is to say, the Zionism that was represented by a person called Achad Ha'am, as opposed to Herzl, but not totally against Herzl's idea, who wanted a kind of a political revolution and a national state. Cultural Zionism was concerned with the inner life of the person, was concerned with renewing the inner spirit, renewing the nature of language. It was a kind of interior development. People that you probably know, like Martin Buber and others, identified with spiritual or cultural Zionism. And their identity didn't have the same kind of political dimension as political Zionism. In many cases, their ideal of going to the land of Israel or Palestine was to live among the Arabs. They had, many of them were very much identified with a binational state. The real issue was the cultural, intercultural transformation, not the political identity, although Bialik, of course, is very concerned with the ability of the people to defend and protect themselves because of all the persecutions that took place. And I'll talk about one of the great ones that transformed cultural civilization, even at the beginning of the press and so on, in 1903. In any case, Bialik leaves Volozhin, and he makes his way, after various peregrinations, to Odessa. Odessa was the place of the Yiddish and Hebrew cultural revival. And it's there that he really begins to develop a kind, and this tension between Yiddish and Hebrew, which really was a tension even in the early state of Israel, which is the language which articulates the people, which is the language, which is the Volkssprach, the kind of folk language, the language that brings out the deepest inner feelings of a person. Bialik actually many of his poems were written both in Hebrew and in Yiddish. But he joins this literary circle. And very soon, by the year 1903, through various people, he becomes one of the editors of one of the great new literary flagship journals called Hashachar, the kind of the dawn of literature, the dawn of cultural renaissance, the dawn of consciousness, the dawn of awareness. However, in that same year, 1903, we can again see the turmoil that was affecting Jews at that time. In 1903, there was an episode that had shockwaves around the world. It was Easter of 1903, and there was a pogrom in the city of Kishinev, in which only dozens of people were brutally murdered, women were raped, and so on. But the world had never, this was sort of like a different universe. The world hadn't heard of atrocities in which you're only talking about a half a dozen people. And the news made its way to the United States. Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president at that time, it appeared in the newspapers. It created a shock. It was still a time where you could be shocked by the death and the pillage and the burning of homes and rape and murder of just a few people. We've come a long way over the last century in terms of the kind of deadening of feelings and the need to reawaken that kind of consciousness. But Bialik was sent to Kishinev in Russia to report on this event. And then later, he was part of an ethnographic unit that was again sent to describe this whole horrendous pogrom, probably the worst pogrom since the middle part of the 17th century, when there were terrible Cossack pogroms in the Ukraine and so on. Bialik writes a dirge that imitates the dirges of the destruction of Jewish cities and people, that mimics and mocks the dirges since the beginning of the Crusades from the 11th century on in the Rhineland, in France, and other places. There were terrible pogroms by the Crusaders as they were on their way to liberate Jerusalem. And a very particular style of cultural lament had developed in Jewish circles. Bialik in 1903 imitates this language of pathos, this language of loss, this language of brutal killing, but he then does so with a tone of rage. It's not just the pathos of loss, but it's the rage that he begins to vent towards the Jewish people who were passive, who hadn't become politically active, who weren't standing up to defend themselves, who were justifying this death in religious terms, who were justifying this in all kinds of legal, cultural terms, and not facing the brutality as he saw it of their situation. This poem, Al-Hashchita, on the slaughter, had enormous effect upon the cultural landscape because it articulated another aspect of his split, not just the child who has lost and the nostalgia for the homeland, for the green spaces, for the pools, for the trees, as we'll see, not just the adolescent who was split down the middle between a traditional life and the fact that it no longer makes spiritual sense anymore, but he couldn't give it up because that's the foundation of his language. It's the foundation of the way he sees the world. Now the split is between passivity and activity. What do you do? What do you do? Is spiritual resistance enough? And how do you develop a form of political protest when you have no political agency, when you're not political, when you're dependent on any country, when you're a minority? How do you develop a language that galvanizes the people? How do you develop a language that gives spiritual vision? Who do you turn to? If you only turn to the political Zionists, it was an entirely different operation of what it means to enter the modern world. To enter history for the political Zionists means that you have to be able to defend yourself in political terms and develop a political base. But that was, for him, a kind of inner emptying. There has to also have been a kind of cultural transformation. And that tension of anger and protest, he was actually one of the ways that Bialik was described for all of his romantic spiritual tone. He was also considered a revival of the prophets, not only in his language, but one of the genres that people described about his language, that he was a Navi Za'am, a prophet of fury. It's the fury of how can you be passive? But the question still was, what do you do? And most of his life was identified with building the national homeland in terms of an international spirit, not just building the national homeland with mortar and stones, but building that inner landscape, which was the crucial issue for him. Bialik's anger at the passivity sometimes led to these enormous epic poems. One of the great epic poems that he wrote was called Metei Midbar, the dead of the desert, where he describes he turns the biblical notion of the wandering through the desert and the political conquest of Canaan with Joshua into an aborted event, into an event in which those who are sort of die and live in are covered by sand. They're kind of mortified, as it were. They have no inner spirit. So Bialik is filled with this rage of passivity, of this inability to actualize, and then the realization, how do you actualize when there's no national home? This is before the Balfour Declaration. This is, there is no political structure. How do you renew the inner spirit when the inner spirit has been totally deracinated? Most of the people had lost contact with the biblical inheritance. Rabbinic Hebrew and medieval Judaism they read the Bible as a kind of base text, but rabbinic culture, it was a totally different form. So how do you do that? And as we'll see, one of the focuses of the course will be two features: how Bialik tried to recreate the classics of the tradition and put them into a modern idiom. So he becomes one of the great anthologizers. He felt that one of the ways of renewing culture was gathering, what he called in Hebrew kinus, gathering and choosing the material in new anthologies that would give the people a sense of depth and a sense of vision, a sense of language that wasn't simply utilitarian language. It wasn't simply the babble of the street. It was a language that was filled with the resonance of the culture, even though it now was speaking to a secular world. While he's writing these issues of language, there was a famous exchange of letters in 1926. It was a time of the great Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig. Some of his colleagues and friends like Buber and others wanted to put together a tribute volume in his 50th year. And Gershom Scholem, who is the founder of modern Jewish mysticism, one of the great Jewish scholars of the century, wrote a letter. His contribution was a letter. And he writes this letter to Rosenzweig, who himself was concerned with the nature of language, how language is the basis of the human imagination and culture. And he talks about his depression of being an early immigrant to Palestine in 22, 23, 24, in which the language had become debased. It no longer had the spiritual energy of the past. And in a certain sense, he says it's like a volcano. It's a volcano waiting to explode because the culture can't sustain itself on a thin sphere of language, and that people have to re-engage their cultural canon, even if they re-engage it as secular people. Bialik feels this. he writes some incredible essays on the nature of language. So in addition to our study about poetry, we are going to actually see what does he think about language. Language, one of his famous essays is called Gilui v'chisui belashon, concealment and revealment. How does language reveal and conceal? This is a decade and more before Heidegger, and many of these issues of writing, feeling the shifts of language over what he called the tehom, over the abyss. What is language over the abyss of nothingness? How do you construct a world, which is what he felt was his spiritual challenge, to write language that closes the abyss, but doesn't foreclose renewal of spiritual energies. And then we'll also be taking a look at some of his writings about these cultural anthologies of what does it mean to kind of re-engage what Israel in those days and even today call the Jewish bookshelf, right? But for him, the bookshelf is not just, it's true, it's not just a aron sefarim, a shelf of books in the house that's ornamental. It is the external embodiment of one's inner layering. So what we're really talking about ultimately is the notion of Renaissance. We're talking about Renaissance that is in conversation with Reformation. The two things in Christian and Western Europe don't quite go together, but we're going to see them how these two notions, Renaissance being in the sense of the renewal and the rebirth of the imagination and language and culture, and the Reformation being a process that in Christianity, of course, begins with Calvin and Luther. And for Judaism, the beginning of this kind of cultural reformation begins in the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century. And Judaism as a traditional culture is still going through its reformation. All the various forms of Judaism is still trying to figure out, how do you negotiate with modernity? Islam, for its side, is beginning its cultural reformation. And all of these tensions between a strict traditional society and people who in many cases, because of the crisis of modernity, become even more observant and more fundamentalistic, both across the spectrum in Judaism and Islam. And that's part of one of the forms in which this tension is beginning to take shape. How do you find a viable language that draws on the depth of the tradition and at the same time doesn't hide from the true crisis that we're facing? And across those of you who are in different kind of communities are certainly aware of how your own religious tradition fits in somehow to that spectrum. Bialik is raising this issue to a heightened form of consciousness. He's not allowing you simply to live on the wake of things, being pulled along on your skis. He's constantly asking, what do you do? How do you change yourself from within? What is your linguistic or spiritual heritage? And how is it manifesting itself so that you can live in both worlds? But I should say that for all of the tension, Bialik was an unapologetic secularist. For me, I find the tension and the level of his language to be so compelling because he looks at the world and sees the world, and yet he understands that if the world is simply denuded and deracinated and empty and turns into a series of utilitarian functions, it has lost its content with 2,000 or more years of tradition. But how you revive, how you renew, how you transform is the key issue. So before I want to kind of make a transition to this tension between the sacred and the profane. But first, I just wanted, in terms of anybody who has any kind of question on some of the historical or broad details that I've just mentioned. Anybody want to kind of, anything that you want to bring up, or anything if I'm not speaking clearly or if I'm speaking fast, I'd be happy to repeat something. Yes, Joe, you're muted.
So can you clarify, you talked about how Bialik is like writing within the tension between like the traditional and the modern, the traditional and the secular, but then toward the end you said that Bialik is like specifically in the secular. Is that true, that he like was like writing in that tension, but he like for sure was on one side, or is there something that I missed in that? I was just
no, you're feeling the tension. You're feeling it. I'm trying to be honest to my understanding of Bialik. What Bialik's first layer, which never leaves him, is the traditional canon of the Bible, rabbinic literature through the Middle Ages, medieval Hebrew poetry, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and up to the modern crisis. What he wanted to do was to turn that language into an instrument for modernity, for what he said is Jewish modernity, how it could speak. So if you're coming and you become a Marxist and you're part of the Marxist movement among the Jews in Russia, and you're coming and you say no more, no more religion, et cetera, what language are you going to speak? How do you revive the Hebrew language? Is the Hebrew language simply a series of lexical topics, or does it encode something? He wants it to encode a depth. And one of the poems we're going to deal with today, I will show you that tension. Part of his pain is he understood this depth, but he also realized that it doesn't work for him anymore, right? He was able to say things because of who he was that probably wouldn't have been tolerated. God doesn't listen, God's away, God's absent, the sky is just covered with red blood. There is no resonance in heaven. The people, but the culture could revive a certain spiritual tone. So he was a kind of a prophetic voice within modernity. It's a hard sell. It's a hard sell. But we're going to see a couple of places where that tries to work. So, and I think if different people can kind of respond to their own kind of experience about this, that will be helpful. Anybody else have any queries so far of what I've been saying? Yes.
I was just wondering. So like he wants to breathe this, I guess, spiritual effervescence, right, into modern Hebrew poetry. That's, I guess, read by a secular audience. But does that mean he wants them to remember it, or does he want them to like also internalize it? Like, is it just
absolutely internalized? It's all internalized. In other words, as we're going to see, I think one of the ways I want to help us read the poetry is you breathe in the words. You don't just speak the words. Mm-hmm. You have to breathe in the words. Now, there's the word, this issue of what is the relationship between absence and presence when we talk about poetry, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things he's concerned with, you have to breathe in the words, and then you breathe out a certain cultural form. In other words, the poet breathes out in a certain sense, but the reader that he's trying to affect has to breathe in that language first, has to breathe it in. How they will be doing that, it will change. It will change. But it's a transformation. That is the hard thing for every culture that wants to bring tradition into modernity. Part of its hard issue is that these cultures have a totally different spiritual origin, and they don't map easily onto a broken secular world. But if you only have a broken secular world, it's thin, it has no cultural depth, it has no resonance. So let me kind of spell maybe a little bit of this out in a certain sense. Is everybody okay? We don't take a break. Can we go on a little bit? Okay, let me just kind of. So I would say that to help you begin to get your head around this problem, probably the key tension, and it will also be the key dialectic, is the tension between the sacred and the profane. The sacred and the profane in time, in space, and in language. Okay, so let me say a few words just to give you a sense of what that is, because a number of people don't have traditional Jewish education or background. I just wanted to give you a sense of the world in which he's going to produce this revolution. And you can then make your identification with it in terms of your background, or I'd like you to kind of jump in as you hear it, because we have people from really of a very broad spectrum of backgrounds and traditions. So the first thing is to think about time, right? So the Jewish notion of time is time as sacred rhythms, as the time of celebrating the movement of the day. Prayers begin with the beginning of natural light, but natural light is not natural. It's the language of creation. It's the light of creation. The course of the sun is not just a solar disk, but it marks the course of the prayer cycle. When the sun begins to turn, it's the beginning of the turning of the spiritual day, and a different series of prayers are recited. The week is divided into more secular and more sacred time. Even though the week is filled with sacred content, the Sabbath becomes a day that's paradigmatic of sacred time, right? In terms of what one does. Well, one doesn't do secular behaviors, secular work, for example, on the Sabbath. Traditionally, people only spoke the sacred language of Hebrew. It's a day of prayer and study. So it becomes a paradigm of the secular day within the course of the week. Jewish spiritual time is affected by this holiday and festival cycle. The entire Jewish year goes through a series of rhythms, not just natural rhythms, but spiritual rhythms of spiritual and personal and national birth and rebirth. Okay? And if one is living within the Jewish mythos traditionally, then one begins with kind of the renewal of the world is the renewal of the soul, the potential renewal of consciousness. It's the renewal of hope. One goes through these cycles and identifies with different events that are then spiritualized or historicized. The issue of the memory of the temple and the lost become a configuration for exile, for loss, for brokenness. And as the whole traditional past gives you, during the cycle of the year, movements from growth to harvest, which is not just natural, but spiritual. It's a movement from building to destruction. It's a movement from inner awareness to loss of awareness. And these are constantly in play every single day and over the course of a year. To say that is to say, you don't, if in a traditional society, you don't exist in secular time. You are totally, there's no outside. There's no outside, right? When we come to the secular world, you are on the outside and maybe looking in. But in traditional terms, you're always on the inside. There is no outside. Where would you go on the outside? The whole world is resonant with divine glory at whatever level a person would understand that. So all language is celebration. All language is gratitude. All language is petition. Language is hope. Language is thanksgiving. Language is acknowledging the world in terms of blessing, right? There's no outside. The same goes for space. There is no outside space. Space is the world. But when we think of the world, we think of the Latin word seculum. So the word seculum is like secular, but seculum is the entire universe. So from a traditional point of view, the world is a creation, which means it's filled with mystery and possibility. It's filled with the occasion of blessing and acknowledgement. It's filled with unexpected events that require one to be surprised, right? In the secular world, you can be very bored. In a traditional world, you can't be bored. You have to be alert to what's happening. Now I'm eating, now I'm smelling, now I'm feeling, now I'm aware, and I have to acknowledge that. And I have a language for that, right? That is within a traditional world. There's no outside that space. I don't step outside and say that there's something outside the flower, outside the tree, outside the harvest. That is the manifestation of the divine glory. That is the place of acknowledgement. That's the space of awareness. And the same holds true for language. Language is that language that has given expression to what it means to see the world, to acknowledge mystery, to have gratitude. It's the language that comes up from the Bible. It's the biblical language that becomes rabbinic language. It's the rabbinic language that becomes medieval Spanish poetry, which we'll talk about. It's the language that then takes on a whole series of vernaculars. But for a traditional society, and I'm sure for some of you, it's a kind of jargon. That is to say, the French Jews spoke a mixture of Old French and Hebrew, or a kind of, the German Jews, a kind of Hochmitteldeutsch, a Middle High German, and Hebrew. The Jews in Italy had a kind of Hebrew and a form of Italian, which was Ladino, a medieval form. Persian Jews the same, Greek Jews the same. There's a kind of Judeo-Arabic. All of these are kinds of blends. So that would be the secular language. The secular language is that meeting point, but it's within the framework of the sacred structure of the community, right? It's what the sociologist Peter Berger called a sacred canopy. Those of you interested in the history of religion, the sacred canopy. So the sacred canopy is an overarching structure of meaning. It's an overarching structure of how time and space. You learn and you pray in a synagogue. The home becomes a kind of mini synagogue or mini temple. Secular space, you bring the outside space is simply a transitional space, and it has religious significance of a whole variety of sorts. I'll take a look at a couple of things from Bialik in a second, but the secular world implodes all of that. It's all the outside, it's all the fragment. It's all the struggle. The meaning is not a priori, it's not immediate. If you grow up in a traditional society, meaning is immediate. It's there. It comes from your parents. Your parents' language is the first language that brings you in, right? School is simply a supplement of that. It's not the place where you learn a kind of new kind of secular culture of the West or the sacred canon and so on and so forth, right? A totally different notion of what it means to be educated into the culture. Just to give you a kind of resonance, the Jewish year simply just finished yesterday with a holiday of Passover. So if you were to go into a traditional home on the holiday of Passover, you would, and the first days, the focus is on the child and the child's ability to do one major thing, to enter the tradition, right? So in Jewish language, it would be called the Masorah. That means the tradition. The whole goal is to begin to have the person speak and feel comfortable and excited by that language. It's not information, okay? The secular world can talk about information. It can talk about integration. It can talk about balance. But what is native to a traditional culture is everything hangs together a priori. You don't have to even think about it. It's already there. One of the, among the crises of what it means to be a modern person is that we're trying to formulate meaning. We're trying to make the connections. We're trying to bring all kinds of things together. Some people do it better ways, and something others, and some people have to totally transform their language. Some people can't find it in their traditional backgrounds. They have to go to another culture, right? But the secular world has changed the nature of the home. What do parents, what's the goal of parental teaching? What's the goal of a school? What's the goal of cultural space? Probably the most powerful that we all experience aspect of being in the secular world, or even a traditional person's secular world, is what we would today call multiculturalism. You don't live in multiple cultures if you're a traditional person. So it produces a whole new issue. What is the notion of identity in multiculturalism? What is the nature of who am I? What language do I speak? Right? The tension between particularism and universalism means one thing if you're a traditional person. It means something absolutely and totally different if you're a secular person. If you're a secular person, multiculturalism can be the dominant value. And then the question is, where do you find, what are the moral parameters? How do you begin to negotiate that? How do you create a society like that? So in many cases, American modernity is faced with this, with a lot of ugly stuff still surfacing, right? From other times where people wanted to stay within a very closed traditional framework. America is has its own, but all the cultures of Europe and in traditional cultures are going through this in different ways with different tensions. Bialik felt this paradigmatically as a poet. So he becomes the national voice. When a person can say this for other people and give them language, then he becomes unique. He became then the movement from nature and the crisis of living in a city and the need for a national homeland. He became the voice of the crisis of tradition and the secular world. He became the voice of what language do I speak? How do I live with depth? How do I live with meaning? What difference does the tradition make if I'm no longer observant? How do I do all of that? Let me just make one other statement that, and then I want to look at a poem or two, because I don't want to burden you too much on the thing. We'll look at it and then we'll call it for a day. But that was one of the reasons that I gave you the famous essay by T.S. Eliot called Tradition and the Individual Talent. Eliot, quite different from Bialik, but beginning with The Wasteland and other poems, he articulated the crisis of a certain kind of Protestant crisis of modernity. And his voice as a religious poet is powerful for all that. But when he talks about tradition and the individual talent, he is trying to talk about how do you shape something from within, right? How do you change it from within? And I'm going to read for you in a second in terms of tradition, the individual talent. Even let me put it this way. Each level of language is a transformation of culture, and it articulates different dimensions. Characteristically, Jewish poetry is religious poetry, and it takes place from the Psalms to the religious poetry in the synagogue liturgical poetry, which is called piyut, like the Hebrew poet, and sacred poetry in the Golden Age of Spain. And I'll show you an example deeply influenced by Arabic poetry as well. That doesn't mean, for example, and here Bialik is resonant with this, that even in a whole series of poems that Jewish society had in the 11th and 12th and 13th century in Spain, this famous Golden Age, particularly the integration of Jewish poetry with metrics and language and themes from Arabic poetry, secular songs, poetry of the garden, poetry of drinking, of fellowship, of love. Even that voice for a traditional person is making use of the traditional language of the poet. I would let me just read the opening line of a poem from the 12th century, early part of the 12th century, by Moses ibn Ezra, who was also a religious poet in Spain, but also did incredible secular poetry. And this is a kind of an exemplification of tradition and the individual talent, which everybody would have felt, so there's a religious resonance even within secularity. Okay, I'm just going to read the first 3 lines, and then I'll read you a translation of it, just so that you can hear the rhythm of the Hebrew, and those of you who know Hebrew can pick up on this. Katnot pasim lavash hagan uksut rikma midei disho umeil tashpeitz ata chol eitz v'chol ayin hera pilo kol tzitz chadash lizman chudash yatsa sochek likrat bo'o. So, as you'll see over the course of the term, I'm not happy with lots of translations, but I want to give you this translation by by Tet Carmi, who is a modern Hebrew poet. But I want to highlight a couple of issues. So let me read it to you this is a poem written in the 12th century, from a person who writes religious poetry, and it's part of the whole culture. It's part of the whole wine song, gazelle songs, for example, that you're aware from the Arabic literature. So this is how it goes in English. The garden put on a coat of many colors, and its grass garments were like robes of brocade. All the trees dressed in checkered tunics and showed their wonders to every eye. The new blossoms all came forth in honor of time renewed, came gaily to welcome him. But at their head advanced the rose, king of them all, for his throne was set on high. He came out from among the guard of leaves and cast aside his prison clothes. Whoever does not drink his wine upon the rose bed, that man will surely bear his guilt. Now that works as a secular poem. But every person in the 11th and 12th century and onward who heard this secular poem, and this is what Bialik is going to be doing in the 20th century. He is going to, everybody would pick up the resonance. So for example, what is the first thing? The garden put on a coat of many colors. Kotnot pasim lavash hagan. The garden takes on the imagery of Joseph's coat of many colors. The spangled imagery of the beds, of the colors. In other words, the earth itself is taking on the paradigmatic covering of a patriarch. What is the relationship between narrative history, biblical narrative history, the description of the garden of one of the patriarchs, and the description of the natural world? And then he goes on to say, he now talks about that these grass garments have the grass has a mud. So that the Hebrew hears immediately the tunic of the priests. When you go out into the world of nature, you are like a priest, a secular priest. You're wearing the garments of the priesthood. Now he's mixing Joseph and the priest. And then he goes on to say, Umeil tashbeitz atah ha'etz. The tree has covered itself. You hear the part, tashbeitz atah ha'etz, but the tashbeitz is the brocade of a priest's vestment. Right? So now, so anybody who hears that, a modern Israeli person, secular person, hears the word tashbeitz and they think of a crossword puzzle, because that's what the word tashbeitz, they crossword. So it makes no sense. Like, so Israelis trying to read this, they're like on another planet. They have no access because they don't have connection with the biblical language. They don't realize that in the book of Exodus 28, this is referring to the priest's tunic, or the loincloth, that would be the madim, or Joseph. They wouldn't hear that. What's ketonet pasim? They would think pasim, they think that it's a kind of a bed of railroad tracks, right? If you're an Israeli, say pasim, so railroad tracks. What's ketonet pasim? It's a cuckoo metaphor, but it isn't a metaphor, right? So what I'm saying is that depending on where you stand in the layering of language, you hear resonance. And for a person like Moses Ibn Ezra, it's tradition, and the individual talent is now giving us a secular wine song. So when he says, if you don't like my poem, you don't want to drink with me, he says, that kind of a a person who doesn't want to drink with me, fooey for that person, he says, will bear his guilt. But anybody who knows their biblical language, yisacheto is a person who has sinned and has to bring an offering, right? So what he's already saying is that this language of joyful fellowship, of singing the songs of nature, of seeing the world in a brocade as if it were a high priest. The world itself is the personification of a priest. And the difference between these layers are melded in a new way. And then if you don't do that, it's as if You have to bring a sacrifice to the temple. You are a sinner. The sinner if you don't enjoy the smells and the sights of nature. Now that's within a traditional culture that's not afraid of the natural world, but the natural world is redolent with the traditional world, right? That's not the world we live in for most of us. The natural world is the natural world, right? It's about as deep as you can sink a seed. It's just nature, right? And things don't connect it. You say, so a person might have to kind of invent a kind of crazy metaphor. But here, the metaphor is arising from the soil. The soil is like a new biblical plantation, right? You're drinking the language of the poetry. So this is tradition and the individual talent. Tradition and the individual talent for the modern person, you can see they don't have that. What is for example, how many of you have read Eliot's The Wasteland? Okay, so what would be, from a purely organizational point of view, the most striking feature of The Wasteland? Outside of the fact that it's secular and trying to create religious language by blending things, half of the end of the book are footnotes to help you understand what the cultural depth is. He's trying to create, you need a cultural thesaurus. When you grow up in a traditional society, you don't need a cultural thesaurus. You've learned your mother's language. You've learned your father's language. You've learned the rhythm in your body. You know how to do it. Doing it is being it. You don't have to put it on. You are it. But we are faced with a different thing. So Eliot had to tell you Shanti, Shanti. You have to know that comes from the Upanishads, right? He has to tell you all these kinds of things because you haven't even read the Upanishads, let alone know that he's trying to help the Upanishads have sense to you in the modern age. Because he's trying to bring it together, tradition and the individual talent, all these kinds of issues. So what I would like to do, I know people probably are getting headache and it's getting a little bit, let me do 10 more minutes with one poem and then we'll break early today, okay? And next time we'll go an hour and a half and then we'll have a break. But I just wanted to keep this flow for this first time so that you can kind of feel all of that rhythm. Anybody have anything that you want to say at this point before we do this? All right, so if you have, I hope you printed out your text and you have the poem in the Hebrew, Zachiti Ba'or Min HaHefker. I didn't win the light in a windfall, or my translation, which I didn't translate, the title. Everybody have that poem? Or if you have it in front of you, great. Okay, good, good. So I'm going to, well, maybe Ido, would you read it in Hebrew? And then I want you to be, what I really want to do is, I'm not trying to trivialize the translators, but if a translator is not inside the language, the whole thing is lost. And Ruth Neveau and Adari, it's fine, but it's not my cup of tea. But I'm going to pick out kind of things to help you feel what needs to be sensed to see what. So I chose this poem both because it has a glint of the issue of light. It talks about his prophetic muse, and it talks about his tension between an individual and the community. So a number of the themes that we've been dealing with, and it'll deal with tradition, the individual talent. So Ido, if you'll read this, then maybe I'll have one person read it in either Nevo's translation or the other, and then I will do mine and try to parse it very quickly, okay? So that you can get a feeling for what's lost in a bad translation and what's embedded in the original that is showing how Bialik is using the tradition in this astonishing new way. Okay, Ido, if you're click out your,
Sure.
okay, great, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we're reading the Hebrew now.
לא זכיתי באור מן ההפקר. לא זכיתי באור מן ההפקר, אף לא בא לי בירושה מאבי, כי מסלעי וצורי ניכרתיו, וחצבתיו מלבבי. ניצוץ אחד בצור ליבי מסתתר, ניצוץ קטן, אך כולו שלי הוא. לא שאלתיו מאיש, לא גנבתיו, כי ממני ובי הוא. ותחת פטיש צרותיי הגדולות, כי התפוצץ ללבבי, צור עוזי, זה הניצוץ אף, ניתז אל עיני, ומעיני לחרוזי. ומחרוזי התמלאת ללבבכם, ובאורשכם הצתיו התעלם, ואנוכי בחלבי ובדמי את הבארה אשלם.
It's an astonishing poem. It's an astonishing poem. So let's, without, let's at least, since in your sheet you probably have Ruth Neveau, I didn't win light in a windfall. Someone read that, and then I will read through mine and try to parse why I chose the language I parse. Who'd like to read this? Anybody? Okay, Mark, please.
I didn't win light in a windfall, nor by deed of a father's will. I hewed my light from granite, I quarried my heart. The mine of my heart a spark hides, not large, but wholly my own, neither hired nor borrowed nor stolen, my very own. Sorrow wields huge hammer blows, the rock of endurance cracks, blinding my eye with flashes I catch in verse. They fly from my lines to your breasts to vanish in kindled flame, while I, with heart's blood and marrow, pay the price of the blaze.
Okay. So as we'll see, Bialik, this is Bialik's I voice, right? I, whether that repeats, it's the voice of confession, and it will also be the voice of loss and lamentation, but particularly it's going to be the voice of the muse and where his spark comes from. So what I want to do is, maybe what I'll just do is, if you look at my translation, and those of you who have the Hebrew, look at it, I just want to bring out a couple of strong features, and then anybody who has a kind of response to the poem, we'll go into other poems more in greater depth, but I want to use this as a kind of way in. So he begins, Lo zachiti va'or mina hefker. I didn't acquire light from abandoned things. So what he's really saying is zachiti is to merit something, or to acquire, to achieve the merit and acquiring something in terms of some form of religious acquisition, right? That you acquire something that has a spiritual quality in the tradition. Now, in modern Hebrew, zachiti, you mean I won the game, right? But it has nothing to do with this, right? He's not, I didn't win light. So she's thinking like a secular person, Ruth Neveau. I don't know who, never met her. But if you say to win, you're already in the framework of a person can win the lottery in modern Hebrew. But that's not, zachiti is to merit something. You can merit saying a certain prayer. You can receive religious merit by doing certain kinds of things. So he's saying it's a matter of acquiring the light. What does it mean to acquire the light? We're going to see acquiring the light is acquiring inner light. It's acquiring the inner spiritual poetry. It's the muse. Where does that come from? Where does that spark of light that changes the eye, right? It's not just the light outside, but what is that place that brings something from the inside so that one sees the world, right? So we're already beginning to feel at the first notion the concern with vision. What do you see? And then, of course, this is the issue of patrimony. When he uses the word hefker, and he doesn't mean a windfall. Hefker means something that's been abandoned, that has no owner. So in traditional rabbinic terms, which is layered in his head, he didn't find it on the road as something that had been abandoned. So in traditional law, there's something that's there's something that's owned, and there's something that's ownerless, and there's something that's in the middle that seems to not have, that can't have an owner. So a desert is hefker, right? It has no owner. You can't own a sand dune, right? In traditional terms, right? There's no boundary to it. So he said, I didn't just get it from something that was thrown out the window, that has no owner, right? And then he goes on to say, Af lo valid, I didn't acquire it, didn't come to me through the inheritance of my father. So he says, not by deed of a father's will. So she's got it, but she doesn't have it. Because Yerusha is something that we say testate, something that's passed down through the courts, that you give an inheritance. So you acquire a patrimony. So he's saying, I didn't get it through something that was negligible and had no cultural ownership to it. It was just floating out there in the wind. Nor is it something that I achieved because my father had something and he passed it on to me, right? As something derivative, but rather, Ki misali v'tzuri nikati. I hewed it out of my rock and my bedrock. Now, anybody who knows biblical Hebrew would know that he's using the language from the prophet Isaiah, because the prophet Isaiah says that Abraham was hewn out of the rock. Right? The rock from which he was hewn. Sarah and Abraham, the rock from which they were hewn. Right? And when he says, Sali uvetzuri, he's playing on the language of King David in the Psalms. God is one's rock. Now he's saying, I have my own inner quarry. Right? So he's already, the inspiration is not coming from God. The inspiration is not being hewn from only one's national granite and quarry, which would be the resonance from the prophet Isaiah, but he's saying from mine. In other words, I have something of my nature, right? That rock is my nature. And my spiritual sustenance, my spiritual growth comes from my nature. Right? So he's using that language, and I carved it from my heart, right? So he's bringing together what? He's bringing together inwardness. He's bringing together naturalness and inwardness. Levavi is already that which brings him to spiritual awareness, right? So there's this inner quarry that is being, and then he goes on to say, there was one spark, nitzotz echad, betzor libi mistater, and there was something. So there's something that was hidden. So he speaks now as a prophet, or as a poet, that despite the turbulence of experience, despite his loss as an orphan, despite all the secular transformations that he went through, there is something pure, this one pure thing that's been left. And the task for him is to find that poetic core, to find that particular space that can open up his inner being, right? That's what he's saying. It's hidden, mistater. Normally, mistater is God is the hidden. right? So he's alluding to the fact there's a divine dimension, but he's not speaking about God who is mistater, who is hiding. It's the spark of some supernatural dimension, something in his heart, which has not been lost through the erasure of tradition. It's not been lost by suffering. It's not been lost by secularism. And he has to find it. It's been hiding there. Nitzotz katan. It's just a nitzotz is something that flashes up. That when you quarry and you hit the flint, it's just going to come from that flint within. Something that he has to quarry so that it arises. Ach kulo sheli. It's all mine. Okay. So this is already very interesting that the poet is going to talk about that his poetic voice comes from the deepest source of inwardness. It doesn't come from the outside, and it doesn't come through the generations and the genes, he's saying. It comes through something within, he says, lo she'iltiv me'ish. And now he's using traditional biblical language to borrow something, right? See, he's been playing, and we're going to see right to the end, he's playing on legal language of inheriting, borrowing, using something that's not mine. I didn't ask it or borrow it. Lo ginativ, and I didn't steal it. All these notions that appear in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, chapter 21 and following, of what it means to acquire something, what it means to own something. And he's using that as the individual talent to tell us that he is going to find ki mimeni uvihi. It's from me and within me. Okay, so we want to take that poetic language very seriously. Mimeni, it's from me, uvi, right? It comes out of some inner place, inner spiritual place. And now he goes to talk about how that spark comes. V'tachat patish tsarotai hagdolot. So he's using this imagery from the book of Jeremiah, that God's word is like a hammer on the rock. Kipatish, as a hammer, yefotze tzela. And the word of God, as it were, flies, the divine word flies in a myriad series of forms. And now he's saying that is his own spiritual consciousness. He has to hit the inner nerve, the inner vein within the rock, so that the nitzotz, that spark, will ignite, right? Something that will happen. So that, yeah, you have to break down that hard granite, something inside. So it's already so interesting. It's like these old notions of this transformation. The fire is within the rock. The fire is within nature. There's a kind of alchemical quality that the medievals would talk about. The alchemical quality is that the inner transformation of nature is taking place through a kind of inner cosmic fire. But for him, it's all internal. The inner passion, the inner drive, that is what's heating that rock. But then he has to work at it. And it's a rock that's been formed, it's a rock that's been formed by sarot, by suffering, by sorrow. It's a rock that's been formed by this issue of, he talks about when he has all these autobiographical poems, when his father died, when his mother died, when there was no food, the disgrace that his mother had to go through. He describes how the bread that she baked was the dough was leavened by her tears. Right? That's Bialik's sense. They were so poor that the dough, midimaot, the dough was leavened by the tears of the mother. Right? That's how, so for him, this notion of the suffering child is never lost, but it's part of his poetic consciousness at the same time. That nitzotz, zeh hanitzotz af nitaz alinai. So it's all internal, but he's saying once I hit that spiritual poetic vein, it's as if it flew up and entered my eye, the spark of one's eye. It illumined me. The glint in my eye, I was able to see again. In other words, whether that's coming up from the inside so that you can see out, but he's using the imagery of the rock and that flame comes from the outside. That needs soats. You light a candelabrum, you light holy candles, but you also ignite your dead spirit, that tzur, that rock that has to be broken open. But there's something, he says, I had that. It wasn't taken away from me. And then he says, and it went from my eye, me'eni lecharuzi. That's an ingenious. That's amazing, right? Because what he's saying, the charuz, in a sense, has this notion of a necklace, right? In the Song of Songs, a charuz is a necklace. But for him, the necklace, the charuz, is the poetic line, right? So from my eye produced the words on the line of the poem. It's an amazing thing, because you can hear the poetry. Suri uzi, nitaz el eini, ume'eni lecharuzi. Here we're talking about the interconnectedness of poetic creativity. It goes from my eye to my poetic line. Right? That you can't separate my line from the spark that ignited my heart. But I had to do it. I had to do the work. There's not inspiration that comes, right? The modern poet is aware of the strife of poetry. And then he goes on, and from my charuz, from my poetic line, yitmaleit lilavavchem, it flew to your heart. He's speaking, who is he speaking to? He's speaking to all the people who adore him in his poetry. From his eye, from his heart to his eye, to his poetic word, and now that spark goes into their soul. And their soul now is inspired. And he goes on to say, Ube'ur ishchem hitzitiv yitalem. He goes, where it fueled your fire and disappeared. Now, he's saying, you couldn't hold it. You couldn't hold the flame. It disappeared. It's totally different from what Navo has or what Hatari has. But you can look at those poems. They work as poems, but they don't work as Bialik's poems. But he's saying it entered into you. And what happened to your spiritual passion? What happened to the renewal of the words that I was giving you? The words just sort of sunk into the ground of your being. They were just, and they evaporated, right? And then go on here. The final lines are totally different from the way they have it here. Va'anochi bechelbi uvedami et habe'era ashalem. Now, anybody who knows from Talmudic times, from rabbinic times, throughout the Middle Ages, chelbi vedami it doesn't mean heart's blood and marrow, or I think Hatari talks about milk. It's cheleb. I mean, that's just off the wall. What he's talking about is the in traditional poetry, if a person is fasting, the substitute for the blood and meat of the sacrifice is their own internal suffering by fasting. So the traditional notion of fasting, that it's as if you were a sacrifice in the temple. When he's referring to that, he's saying that I was a korban, I was an offering. I was suffering in this, that it comes from my total offering of my inner nature. And then he goes on to say, et habe'era ashalem. Now this is, it's not, pay the price of the blaze. But what it's saying is, I shall pay the price. What is he referring to? anybody, so I'm saying I pick up the resonance, but I want to share that with you so you can see the tradition and the individual talent. He's referring to a text in the book of, a legal text in the book of Exodus. If I have if I am building a fire, and my fire and the wind comes and it blows some spark onto your hedgerow and it burns down your vineyard or your hedgerow, I have to pay, according to biblical law and rabbinic law, according to the best of the produce that would have grown in that vineyard. And what he's now saying is, I'm going to have to pay the price of my own inner being for what I gave you out of my pain and you just squandered, right? I'm going to pay that price. The price of creativity, the price of being a national poet, the price of hewing my heart so that I could inflame you and myself. And then it just like water in a ditch, it just evaporated. I am going to have to pay that price for that fire. And he's alluding that. Is it biblical and rabbinic law? Obviously not. He has now taken this to find a new language of creativity, a new language of what it means to have a muse, to be your own muse, but that the muse also is something, poetry is forged from pain. You were going to ask something, Tim, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm just
Okay.
kind of like, I'm thinking about the way that the I is being used here.
Please.
Is it, well, I don't know how to take it. Like if to take it as the collective kind of national I that's like trying to repair the brokenness of the shift into modernity, or is it him? Is he talking
His I is
personally?
him. This is totally
His I is him.
I. It's his
Okay.
I, and the plural chem in Hebrew is the second person collective plural. It's you,
Okay.
you, the nameless other, but the
Okay.
person for whom he wrote the poetry, right? So he is using traditional language to talk about his pain of creativity, what he suffered and how he's doing that. And he's now giving us an insight into the source. The source of his poetry is, what is that nitzotz, that little spark? It's the hidden pain that he can't communicate. It's the pain of loss. It's the pain of splitting that we've been talking about. It's that pain of his mother's tears. It's the pain of being hungry. It's the pain of being mocked. It's the pain of being a lonely person who can't share his language. It's the pain of poetry. It's the pain of the loss of the tradition, right? And he wanted to share that because that is what the people have been built out of. It's not just him. Oh, I think Miton has been waiting up there. Hold on. Okay. It's been lost in that notion. And that is where he has been renewed. So let's just, anybody want to respond to this? And then I think we'll call it for today. I'm sorry I really held on to you a little longer, but anybody want to kind of pick up on anything about the I or any of the kind of questions that, like Anissa, you had asked earlier about who's speaking, where it's coming from? Anybody want to, or respond personally to any of the issues? I'd like to just hear where you're coming from and some things that I should bear in mind, okay? Because I wanted to be able to build the class around things that you care about. So what did I say that you care about? And what did I say that you'd like me to flesh out or that I wasn't saying? So that I can address that next time. Yes, Ido, please.
One of the things I wondered about reading was how much exactly of Eliot maps onto here in terms of, other than the issue of individuality and tradition, Eliot really emphasizes the idea of poetry as a depersonalization.
Yeah.
And that I'm not entirely kind of personally convinced with like Dan Miron's narrative of the I that gets intermingled with the national I and then separated and all these
Yeah,
very so I'm just wondering to what extent we can think of Bialik's, for example, in this song, which is full of ego and almost this anger toward his audience and highlighting the very, very personal and comes from the very biographical, to what extent this can be thought of as a depersonalization, which seems to kind of be underlying Eliot's idea that the poet is really just tapping into something that existed before him and will exist after him and kind of erases him.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say I'm not a fan of Don Miron's, but that chapter, it's a little complicated. But what I want to respond to the main thing that you're talking about, and that is, I think Bialik is aware that poetry and the new civilization is made word by word. And each word comes from his flesh and blood. Each word is a transformation, because what he has done is he has renewed biblical language. His poetry is a modernist poetry, but it is biblical Hebrew, even though he has all of these neologisms, the same way that Agnon is rabbinic Hebrew. Even though it talks about modernism, it's all rabbinic language. This is all biblical language. That's why I went back and took a look at Moses or Moshe ibn Ezra, because it's again a renewal. It's not the recovery of a lost civilization. It's the recovery of a new moment of a great civilization in which the language has gone stale. That's why he has to take in that entire canon and suffer it and find a way in which word by word can speak to the pain of what it means to see the world again, to see the world fresh, to have a religious sense within a secular context, right? We're gonna have to see it slowly, but the same way that Romanticism in the 19th century, and he's a Romantic poet, is trying to again find religious meaning in the world of nature. He wants to find religious meaning in the world of nature, but he wants that meaning to resonate with old strata of biblical and rabbinic Hebrew. So it's it is ego in the sense that a great poet is always talking about himself or herself. Any great person like that, you start with their inner world, and everything is their inner world, even whatever else they're talking about. They're talking about their world, their suffering, their creativity as a paradigmatic prism into the culture, right? It may be many, many, many other things, but it's always the self. That doesn't, from my point of view, it doesn't make it egoistic poetry. It means that he's trying, as a modernist, trying to come in contact with subjectivity. And maybe we should just put it this way. He's trying to come in contact with a subjectivity that can speak the objective language of past tradition while remaining subjective. Can you feel that tension? If you've come from a traditional society or you know that, it's a delicate issue, but it's not egotistical. It's self-absorbed. It's self-absorbed. But what poet is not self-absorbed? Of course it's self-absorbed, but that's what makes the poet great. The poet can go inward, but see outward. Of course you have to be self-absorbed. Even if you're filtering, like Moshe ibn Ezra, that garden song, and the garden being a kutonet pasim, but it's coming through his own voice. So a poet is aware of voice. The poet is, and that voice can either be deeply subjective, but it's the I, right? Let me. I think that there was one other poem, and maybe we'll stop with that of Ibn Ezra, just so that you can. I guess one other, yeah. Just so you could hear it. So you tell me. So this is Moshe Ibn Ezra. This will stop, okay? So he's speaking in his. What is the goal of poetry here now in the 12th century? He's to change another person, right? So let's just listen to this. All who are sick at heart and whose cry is bitter, moan and sigh no longer. Enter the garden of my poems and find balm for your sorrow and joy and song. Honey beside their taste is sour. Their scent makes myrrh the foulest odor. Through them the deaf man hears, and speech comes to stammers. The blind see and the lame race forth. Men who grieve and despair in them rejoice, and all who are sick of heart and whose cry is bitter. The language of poetry restores the soul. And here he's giving the poem for that heart that has become dry. It's like a wine. It's an elixir. It's a spiritual contact with God, who's the source of the vine, right? And for Bialik, he's trying, the tradition has been smashed. So now he's taking a fragment of that smashed glass and holding it up to the light and letting that light shine into his heart, and letting that come up through his eye and go into the poetic line, so that that poetic word glints the same way, and then it glints into the eye of his reader. And then lo and behold, it just sunk there. Like, well, who, he said, for whom do I labor? To whom do I work? What's my poetry for? But the poetry is for the resurrection of the soul. And that's what a poet is striving for, the resurrection of their soul. If a poet feels lost and abandoned, they feel dead inside. And the poetic word is the resurrection. And what Bialik is trying to do through his own inner resurrection of spiritual consciousness is to resurrect the nation. Sometimes they go together one way, sometimes they go together another way, sometimes it's irony, and sometimes, but it's never depersonalized. It's never, if it's anything, it's always personal. That doesn't mean I share Kurzweil and Miron. It's always personal. But in a certain sense, and maybe with this we'll close, that too is part of the crisis of modernity. Part of the crisis of modernity, or at least the way I feel it, or maybe you can express it, is that in some ways, you always are speaking your personal voice first and your cultural voice second. Right? And you're trying not to lose that cultural voice. A traditional person would speak their cultural voice first, and their personal voice would be embedded in it. But those who feel the pain of modernity are trying to find a language that works. And that's the pain that a poet is articulating in the strongest possible way. So next time, what I want to do is I want to actually, because I did want to share that great poem by Wallace Stevens with you. We'll begin with that and talk a little bit about issue of light, and then we'll turn to that. Anybody have anything to say before, or that can help us for next class? That you can give me some advice. I'm going to try to resolve this issue of the computer. Bear with me. I have my limitations, but I'm going to do my best. So don't give up. I'll be here next week. Anybody have anything you want to say? If you're thinking of wanting to your first paper and you want to, just send me an email, okay? If I can be helpful, but trust your own sense of when you're ready. but I wouldn't let more than a couple of weeks go, because then it just piles up. But trust your own inner sense. If you are, I know that Ben Aaronson, you're interested in, if you want to write something on a historical part of the moment, and you look and take a look at the, I mean, I want the course to work for you. So if it's a philosophical question, if it's a poetic question, if it's a historical question, these prompt aspects should work for you. If it's a comparative question, okay, whatever you find there, I want it to be your question and the thing that stimulates you from the reading, okay? And it's very moving for me to see, you know, how many different backgrounds we share. So I think a lot of us feel this issue of what does it mean to carry a tradition forward into the modern world with eyes wide open. That's the real issue, eyes wide open, okay? So good to see you all, and look forward to seeing you next week. Send me any kind of a note if you want, okay? Take care, I'm gonna shut this down now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sure, take care, everybody.